spread the word and tell the world to intervene and stop the war.
Many more just suffer in silence. I was locked up in a small dark room where I was beaten up with wires, batons and plastic pipes. I was also burned with cigarette butts. And they raped me. Kalai's story is the story of many Tamils, forced to work for the Tigers, detained by the government. The report says the UN repeatedly condemned the Tamil Tigers for serious human rights violations, but largely avoided mention of the government's responsibility. Senior UN officials said this was because the information could not be verified. But the report says the information had been verified to a good standard. The report notes that throughout the final stages of this bloody conflict, the UN issued only one statement condemning both sides. There was also a reluctance to publish casualty figures. Why did this happen? Well, the report explains it in this way. It says decision-making across the UN was dominated by a culture of trade-offs. Choosing not to speak out against a government that was, in the words of the report, intimidating UN staff was seen as the only way to increase humanitarian access. In the final stages of the war, the government set up what it called welfare villages for displaced people emerging from the war zone. In reality, they were military-run internment camps to screen people suspected of involvement with the Tamil Tigers. The UN confronted a dilemma. It had no independent access to locations with persistent allegations of human rights abuses. But it decided there was an imperative to provide urgent food and medical supplies. But the report notes the considerable consternation within the aid community over this involvement. Sri Lankan civilians questioned it too.
They did help the people in the camps by supplying food and other essential items, but that's not very helpful, because we were kept there as prisoners of the government, and it's almost like someone visiting a prison and supplying sweets to the prisoners. It wouldn't save our lives, and they didn't guarantee any protection for us.
The report does highlight the positive role of some UN staff on the ground and the Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. But it's categorical. There was a systemic failure. Everything from the UN's sense of its mission and its machinery was at fault.
The UN should be the moral conscience of the world, but...
Edward Mortimer is a former senior UN official who now chairs the Sri Lanka Campaign for Human Rights and Justice.
There was no UN force in Sri Lanka, but there were people who were there to help the population, and they left actually at the moment when the population needed them more than ever. The government wanted them out of the way essentially because they didn't want anybody to see what was happening.
You were part of that UN system, if indeed there was a systemic failure in Sri Lanka. Is there any hope that it can be different?
Many of us think now, and some people said at the time, that there was an issue of responsibility to protect in Sri Lanka, but unfortunately it didn't get remotely the kind of publicity that, for instance, we got in Libya when Colonel Gaddafi was threatening to destroy Benghazi street by street. I mean, the north of Sri Lanka was effectively destroyed field by field and tree by tree and hospital by hospital. But we didn't get that kind of reaction. Of course, Sri Lanka doesn't have much oil and it's not situated on the Mediterranean. The UN Secretariat sometimes should speak up and say, hey, this isn't good enough. You may have your strategic great power interests and rivalries, but you're also supposed to enforce international law and to uphold certain principles. And I don't think in this case you're doing it.
The report points out that during the last months of the war, there was not a single formal meeting of the UN Security Council. But the engagement by UN headquarters with member states was heavily influenced by what they perceived member states wanted to hear, rather than by what they needed to know if they were to respond. The end of Sri Lanka's vicious civil war unfolded in a world which largely looked away as the government vowed to crush a terrorist group banned in many countries, including Britain. Now the UN says it wants to learn lessons from this conflict as it confronts new crises in places like Syria. It took a risk in ordering this report. We're told it now wants to act on it. But the war in Sri Lanka won't end until there's a proper reckoning. Many say that means an independent international investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity. That would demand a kind of courage and commitment we now know the UN didn't show throughout the years of battle.